The tea has grown cold in its porcelain cups. Outside, the London fog presses against the window panes like a damp wool shroud. But inside the parlor, the air is thick with a different kind of heaviness. A family sits in the amber glow of the oil lamps, their black mourning clothes absorbing the light until they seem like shadows themselves. They are waiting. Their fingers are spread lightly across the polished mahogany of the dining table, barely touching the surface. For months, this room has been a tomb of silence, a place where the only sound was the rustle of silk and the quiet sob of a mother who cannot let go. Then it happens. A single sharp vibration pulses through the wood. A wooden knock, clear and rhythmic, echoes from beneath the grain. In this moment, the boundary between the living and the dead does not just blur. It breaks. This was the birth of a movement that would consume the Victorian world. Spiritualism operated as a complex social technology, a structured system designed to manage the impossible weight of grief, to grant sudden authority to the marginalized, and to turn the private ache of loss into a public performance of the miraculous. This is a history written in echoes and shadows. Our journey begins with the simple vibration of a table wrap, a primitive code that quickly evolved into a sophisticated machinery of contact. We will trace the evolution of these spiritual tools, from the domestic furniture of the early believers to the complex technologies of slate writing and spirit photography. We will witness the rise of the medium, the female figure who claimed a voice that society otherwise denied her, and watch as the intimate séance transformed into a grand theatrical spectacle. This craze eventually forced the greatest minds of the Victorian age into a desperate search for scientific truth, pitting the Society for Psychical Research against the most clever frauds of the century. Throughout it all runs the deep, dark current of human bereavement. In an era of industrial upheaval and relentless mortality, the séance offered a glimmer of hope that the grave was not an ending, but a doorway. We return now to the mid-19th century, to a world where the heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the night, and the living are reaching out to the dark. The circle is joined. The silence is waiting to be broken. The revolution did not begin in a cathedral, a university, or a laboratory. It began in a cramped, drafty upstairs bedroom of a humble wooden house in Hydesville, New York. The year was 1848, a time when the world felt both shrinking and expanding under the weight of the industrial age. The Fox family had been plagued for weeks by strange, rhythmic thumping sounds that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of their rented home. These were not the settling groans of an old building or the scratching of vermin. These were jarring, deliberate vibrations that shook the bedsteads and rattled the wash basins. On the night of March 31st, young Kate and Maggie Fox decided to treat the terrifying noise as an intelligence rather than a nuisance. Kate snapped her fingers in the dark and issued a challenge to the unseen force, asking it to do as she did. To the astonishment of the family, the house replied with the same number of raps. When she clapped her hands, the walls clapped back. This was the moment that transformed a localized haunting into a global phenomenon. The girls, through a mixture of childhood play and sudden, terrifying insight, established a primitive binary code. They called the entity Mr. Splitfoot, a name that carried a playful nod to the devil. Yet the implications of their discovery were far from lighthearted. Within days, the small house was besieged by curious neighbors, farmers, and local officials. The interpretation shifted almost instantly from a haunting to a revelation. These were not random noises. They were messages from the beyond. The Fox sisters claimed that a peddler had been murdered in the house years prior and buried beneath the cellar floor, and the raps were his desperate attempt to be heard. As the sisters were moved to nearby Rochester for their safety, the raps followed them. This was the moment when ordinary furniture was refunctioned as communication hardware. A kitchen chair was no longer just a seat. It was a potential transmitter for the departed. A dining table was no longer just a place for meals. It was a sounding board for the infinite. This was the spark that ignited a fire across the American landscape, offering a tangible, mechanical proof of the soul's persistence, wrapped in the familiar, comforting aesthetic of the Victorian home. The news of the Rochester rappings did not remain confined to the dusty roads of upstate New York for long. It rode the lightning of the era's burgeoning information networks, carried by the very technologies that were making the world feel smaller. The mid-19th century was a time of unprecedented mobility, where coastal mail steamers and merchant exchanges acted as the nervous system of a globalizing world. Information flowed across the Atlantic with a speed that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. News of the Fox sisters arrived in Britain not as a single sudden explosion, but as a creeping tide of press items, private letters, and whispered reports from returning sailors and merchants. By the early 1850s, the British public was primed for a new kind of wonder. The Victorian era was already obsessed with the telegraph, a technology that allowed human thought to travel across vast distances over invisible wires at the speed of light. It was a very short leap for the public imagination to believe that if a wire could carry a voice across a continent, perhaps a celestial telegraph might exist between this world and the next. In 1852, a professional medium named Maria Hayden arrived in London from America, bringing the practice into the very heart of the British Empire. The press coverage was immediate and often scathing, yet every mocking editorial and every skeptical report only served to spread the word further. One composite report from a Liverpool merchant described the scene on a returning packet ship, noting how passengers would huddle in the steerage to listen for knocks on the bulkheads, desperate to see if the American spirits had followed them across the ocean. This was a movement carried by the speed of news, where a rumor in a New York parlor could become a ritual in a London drawing room within a matter of weeks. The Atlantic was no longer a barrier. It was a conduit for the voices of the dead. As the practice took root in British soil, it underwent a subtle but profound transformation to fit the rigid sensibilities of the Victorian middle class. In the small towns of Yorkshire and the growing industrial cities of the north, the séance became a new form of household ritual. It was a way for grieving families to reclaim a sense of agency in the face of the era's high mortality rates and the cold impersonality of urban life. In many ways, early British spiritualism functioned as a domestic science. Families would gather after the evening tea, drawing the heavy velvet curtains tight against the streetlights and extinguishing the gas lights until only the flickering embers of the coal fire remained. They followed a strict, if evolving, protocol that blended the sacred with the mundane. They would sit in a circle, their fingers spread lightly across the polished mahogany of a dining table, forming a continuous chain of human energy. They would wait in a silence so heavy it felt physical, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock or the distant rumble of a passing carriage. Then, the first rap would come. It might be a faint tick, like a fingernail on wood, or a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. One characteristic vignette from the time describes a family in a small village sitting for hours with a small tripod table, asking for the spirit of a lost son to count to 3. When the table tipped 3 times with a deliberate heavy grace, the mother did not scream in terror. She wept with a quiet, profound relief. The séance was not just a spectacle of the supernatural. It was a new social space where the hierarchies of Victorian life could be briefly suspended in favor of a shared, supernatural intimacy that promised a reunion beyond the grave. This movement survived and flourished because it developed what we might call a ritual grammar. It was a stabilizing set of protocols that made the practice repeatable, easy to learn, and remarkably resilient to failure. The most basic element was the yes or no knock, usually established as 1 rap for no and 3 for yes. From this simple foundation, the practice evolved into the more complex alphabet method. A sitter would recite the letters of the alphabet slowly, and a rap would signal when a specific letter was reached. In this way, messages were laboriously spelled out, word by word, from the beyond. This was followed by the phenomenon of table turning, where the furniture would begin to rotate or tilt under the light touch of the sitters, seemingly guided by an external, invisible force. Later came the use of slates, where a piece of chalk would be placed between 2 bound boards, only for a message to appear on the inside surfaces after a period of silence. This grammar was essential because it allowed ordinary people to operate an evidentiary practice without the need for a priest, a scientist, or a specialized education. You did not need a degree to sit at a table and wait for a sound. You did not need a liturgy to hear a knock on the floor. This simplicity granted the movement a democratic power that bypassed traditional institutions. It also provided a layer of plausible deniability that protected the belief. If a session failed to produce a result, it was not because the spirits did not exist. It was because the conditions were not right. The circle was broken by a skeptic, or the atmosphere was too heavy with doubt. The protocol itself became a protective shell, ensuring that the movement could survive even in the face of silence. By the mid-1850s, the initial curiosity had curdled into a genuine public controversy that divided families and filled the pages of the national press. The responses from the established pillars of society were a mixture of profound alarm and sharp, biting mockery. The clergy were among the first to react, with many ministers denouncing the rappings as either a dangerous delusion or, more worryingly, the work of literal demons seeking to lead the faithful astray. Local magistrates expressed concern over the potential for fraud and the mental stability of those who spent their nights talking to furniture instead of attending to their duties. The press, meanwhile, found in spiritualism a never-ending source of copy that sold papers. A typical paragraph from a London newspaper of the time might describe a séance as a pathetic display of human gullibility, where the only spirits present were the ones found in the host's brandy decanter. They mocked the idea the majestic dead, the poets and kings of history, would spend their eternity rapping on cheap mahogany to tell a widow where she had mislaid her sewing needles. Yet, despite the ridicule, the movement only grew in strength. The mockery of the elites was often seen by believers as proof of their own special insight into a higher reality. They were the pioneers of a new frontier that the old world was too frightened or too cynical to explore. This tension between public scorn and private conviction set the stage for the next decade of the craze. It ensured that spiritualism would not remain a mere parlor trick, but would instead become a battleground for the very definition of truth in the modern world. The table had been turned, and it was not going back. The Victorian home was a landscape of heavy, solid objects. It was a world of thick mahogany, carved oak, and dense velvet, where every piece of furniture was designed to signal permanence and domestic stability. Yet, as the spiritualist craze took hold, these mundane household props were radically remade into evidence of the impossible. The democratization of the séance relied entirely on this accessibility. You did not need a specialized laboratory or a consecrated altar to speak with the dead. You only needed a common kitchen table or a set of parlor chairs. This lack of a barrier to entry was the movement's greatest strength. It allowed the practice to bypass the gatekeepers of science and religion. When a family gathered in their dining room, they were refunctioning their domestic environment into a makeshift laboratory. The table became a platform, a physical interface between two worlds. The way these objects were used was deeply specific. Sitters would often choose smaller, lighter tripod tables for their mobility, or larger dining surfaces for more ambitious circles. The physical contact of hands upon the wood was seen as a way to charge the object with a collective magnetism. This was an era fascinated by the invisible forces of electricity and steam, and it was easy for the Victorian mind to view a wooden table as a conductor for a similar, though more ethereal, energy. By using what they already owned, believers transformed the familiar safety of the home into a site of supernatural inquiry. The very stability of the furniture served to ground the experience, making the extraordinary events feel like a natural extension of daily life. As the movement evolved, the need for more permanent records of communication grew. The fleeting, percussive raps of the early years were evocative, but they left no trace behind once the silence returned. This led to the rise of textual apparitions through slate writing and automatic writing. The slate and pencil method was particularly compelling to the Victorian obsession with material proof. In a typical demonstration, a medium would take two clean school slates, place a tiny fragment of slate pencil between them, and then bind or lock the boards together. The sitter might even sit on the slates or hold them firmly in their own hands. After a period of concentrated silence or the chanting of hymns, a rhythmic scratching sound would emanate from within the wood and stone. When the slates were opened, a message would be found scrawled across the inner surface, often in a handwriting that the sitter recognized as belonging to a deceased loved one. This was a profound shift in the technology of contact. A written message was a lasting artifact, something that could be held, quoted, and circulated among friends. It transformed a momentary experience into a piece of documentary evidence. Parallel to this was the practice of automatic writing, where the medium's own hand became the instrument. The medium would fall into a trance, their pen or pencil racing across the paper with a speed and fluidity that seemed beyond their natural capability. These messages often adopted a specific structure, beginning with a formal greeting and ending with a signature that served as a seal of authenticity. The written word provided a bridge of continuity, a textual shadow of the departed that could be archived and revisited, reinforcing the belief that the dead were not just present, but actively participating in the lives of the living. The most startling and controversial technology of contact, however, was spirit photography. By the 1860s, photography was no longer a rare novelty, but a central part of Victorian visual culture. It was viewed as an objective chemical process that could not lie. The camera was the ultimate witness. When William Mumler in America and later various practitioners in Britain claimed to capture the images of ghosts on film, it sent a shockwave through the culture. The process was arduous and deeply tactile. It involved the wet plate method, where a glass slide was coated in a sticky substance called collodion, dipped in a silver nitrate bath, and rushed into the camera while still damp. The sitter would remain perfectly still for several seconds, or even minutes, in a studio filled with the sharp, acidic smell of chemicals. When the plate was developed in the darkroom, a second, faint figure would often appear hovering behind the living subject. These figures were usually blurred, pale and wrapped in ethereal drapery, matching the cultural expectation of what a soul should look like. To the modern eye, these are clearly the result of double exposure or the clever use of pre-prepared plates. But to a Victorian mourner, they were a revelation. This was the materiality of the spirit. The photograph offered a way to see what the eye could not, using the chemistry of light to reveal a hidden reality. These images were treated with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. They were proof that the dead occupied the same physical space as the living, captured by the cold, impartial eye of the machine. These material artifacts did not remain confined to the private rooms where they were created. They entered into a complex economy of circulation, moving from the parlour to the print shop and into the hands of the wider public. Spirit photographs were reproduced as carte de visite, small cards that were highly collectible and easily traded. People would keep albums of these ghostly encounters, placing the image of a dead relative alongside portraits of the Queen or famous actors. Written messages from Slates were transcribed and published in spiritualist journals like The Medium and Daybreak, where they were analyzed and debated with the same intensity as political news. This commodification of evidence changed the nature of the movement. It was no longer just a private experience, it was a reproducible product. Photographs and written testimonials became advertisements for the mediums who produced them, creating a market for miracles that spanned the Atlantic. A medium whose spirits could produce clear, legible writing or recognizable photographic portraits could command higher fees and larger audiences. This circulation created a feedback loop where the expectations of the public were shaped by the images and texts they saw in the press, which in turn influenced the types of manifestations that mediums sought to produce. The afterlife was being mapped, photographed, and printed, turned into a tangible commodity that could be bought, sold, and collected in a leather-bound album. The ultimate effect of this material evidence was epistemic. It changed the way people knew what was true. In an age where traditional religious authority was being challenged by Darwinian science and industrial materialism, spiritualism offered a new kind of certainty based on the senses. You did not have to take the afterlife on faith. You could hear it knock, see it on a slate, and hold its photograph in your hand. These material objects created memory anchors that made skepticism incredibly difficult to maintain. If you possessed a photograph of your dead daughter standing behind you, a scientist's explanation of double exposure felt cold and inadequate compared to the visual testimony of your own eyes. The physical nature of the evidence allowed believers to build a documentary claim to the truth that was harder to collapse into private doubt. Even when a medium was exposed as a fraud, the individual artifacts often retained their power for the owners. The object had become a sacred relic of a personal connection. This shift toward the material and the technical was the defining feature of the mid-Victorian craze. It was an attempt to use the tools of the modern world to prove the existence of the ancient soul. As we move forward, we will see how this same material evidence, which bolstered the faith of so many, also became the primary target for the gendered authority and the scientific investigations that would eventually seek to dismantle the movement from within. The Victorian era was a time of rigid borders, particularly those drawn between the public life of men and the private, domestic life of women. For a woman of the mid-19th century, authority was a rare and fragile thing, usually confined to the nursery, the kitchen, or the sewing room. The public square, the pulpit, the courtroom, and the scientific lecture hall were the exclusive domains of men, places where a female voice was rarely heard, and even more rarely respected. Yet, spiritualism offered a strange and unexpected loophole in this social contract. It was the concept of the passive vessel. Because women were culturally viewed as more sensitive, more emotional, and more spiritually receptive than men, they were seen as the perfect conductors for the voices of the dead. Their supposed biological weakness was reframed as a supernatural strength. In the trance state, a woman was no longer speaking for herself. She was a conduit for a higher power, a neutral wire through which the infinite could flow. This allowed her to command a room filled with educated men, to deliver complex philosophical orations, and to act as a bridge between worlds, all while maintaining the vital shield of Victorian respectability. She was not being assertive or transgressive. She was simply being used by the spirits. This paradox allowed female mediums to occupy a public role that combined religious fervor with a high-stakes performance. Middle-class respectability, which usually demanded a quiet and subservient presence, became the very thing that enabled the public to pay attention to these feminine gifts. The parlour, the ultimate site of female domesticity, was transformed into a site of radical female authority, where a woman's word was the final law. High-profile figures like Cora L.V. Scott, who began her career as a child medium in the American West before conquering the halls of London, became the true celebrities of the movement. Cora would stand before massive, hushed audiences in a deep trance state and deliver eloquent, sophisticated lectures on topics ranging from the nature of the soul to the intricate structure of the planetary systems, subjects that a young woman of her background and limited formal education would never have been expected to to master. These women were not just spiritual guides. They were symbols of a new kind of intellectual agency. Beside these famous names were thousands of everyday mediums, often working-class women for whom mediumship offered a desperate escape from the crushing poverty of domestic service or the dangerous monotony of factory work. For these women, the motives were a complex and often inseparable mix of genuine belief and economic necessity. A successful medium could earn a living that far exceeded what she could make as a governess or a seamstress. She could travel across the country, stay in fine hotels, and enter into elite social networks that would otherwise have been firmly closed to her. They were paid in more than just coins. They were paid in influence and the rare currency of being listened to. In the small, smoke-filled rooms of industrial towns in the north of England, a local medium might be the most powerful person in her community, the one who held the keys to the hearts of the grieving and the secrets of the dead. These archetypal figures, whether they were celebrated public orators or quiet village seers, represented a fundamental shift in the labor of the spirit. They were professional mourners, emotional therapists, and gifted entertainers all at once, carving out a space for themselves in a world that preferred them to be invisible and silent. The trance repertoire was a grueling physical and vocal display that turned the medium's body into a literal stage for the supernatural. It often began with a visible, sometimes violent shift in the medium's physical state, a rhythmic fluttering of the eyelids, a heavy change in the depth of breathing, and a noticeable, chilling drop in body temperature that sitters often remarked upon with awe. To the observers, this was the essential evidence that the woman's own personality was being forcibly pushed aside to make room for another entity. Then came the manifestations themselves. Some mediums would speak in voices entirely different from their own, adopting the gravelly, salt-worn tones of an old sailor or the high-pitched, innocent lilt of a long-dead child. These were known as spirit controls, personalities that acted as gatekeepers for the medium. This trance speech was a stream of consciousness that could last for hours, weaving complex narratives and personal messages. Others practiced automatic writing, where their hands would race across stacks of paper with a speed and a mechanical fluidity that left their observers breathless. In the more advanced and controversial séances, materializations occurred. Ectoplasm, a mysterious, gauzy, and often moist substance, was said to flow from the medium's mouth, nose, or ears, sometimes forming into the recognizable hands or faces of the departed. This was the gendered labor of the trance, a physically demanding performance that left the medium visibly exhausted, pale, and depleted. Her body was the bridge, the living matter through which the spirit world could manifest its presence. This labor was not merely psychological. It was a profound sensory experience for the sitters, who would watch, listen, and sometimes touch the cold, trembling hands of the woman who claimed to be standing in the gap between two lives. The cultural response to these women was deeply ambivalent, vibrating constantly between the poles of hallowed sanctity and bitter, suspicious scorn. To her supporters and believers, the female medium was a sanctified figure, a modern-day saint who brought tangible comfort to the brokenhearted and scientific proof of life eternal to a cynical, materialistic age. She was seen as a pure, delicate being who sacrificed her own vitality and health for the sake of providing consolation to others, However, to her detractors and the skeptical press, she was a figure of profound suspicion and potential moral decay. Critics often read these performances through the lens of Victorian medicine, labeling the trance state as a form of hysteria or a manifestation of a disordered, overstimulated female biology. The accusations were almost always gendered in their nature. If a medium failed to produce a result, she was dismissed as a weak-willed, attention-seeking hysteric. If she succeeded, she was accused of being a cunning, cold-blooded, and immoral fraud. There was a constant agonizing tension regarding her personal reputation. Because the séance often took place in total darkness and involved physical contact between the medium and the sitters, it carried a transgressive, even erotic undertone that made many Victorian commentators deeply uncomfortable. The dynamic of reputation was a razor-thin tightrope. A single slip, a single caught hand in the dark, or a single accusation of impropriety could ruin a woman's career, her social standing, and her life forever. The terms of accusation were rarely about the technical facts of the séance alone. They were about the medium's character, her modesty, and her adherence to the strict, unforgiving codes of Victorian womanhood. Ultimately, mediumship functioned as a fraught and dangerous route to personal autonomy. It offered a way for women to earn their own money and make their own names, providing a level of independence that was nearly impossible to achieve through traditional means. A successful medium was an entrepreneur of the invisible, managing her own bookings, her own public image, her own travel arrangements, and her own finances in a world that often treated women as legal minors. Yet, this hard-won independence came at a high psychological and social cost. The risks were immense and ever-present. An exposure as a fraud was not just a professional failure. It was a public humiliation that could lead to immediate social exile and the loss of one's livelihood. The very authority they claimed was entirely contingent on their perceived passivity and lack of will. The moment they were seen as being too active, too calculating, or too intelligent, the illusion of the spirit control shattered. This paradox reflects the broader structural limits on women's independence in the 19th century. They could lead, but only while pretending to follow a ghost. They could speak with the voice of a lion, but only while pretending to be a silent lamb. The history of the female medium is a history of women navigating the narrow, dark gaps in the walls of their society, using the language of the spirit to voice their own presence in a world that was trying its best to look right through them. Their labor was the foundation upon which the entire spiritualist movement was built, a lasting testament to the power of the marginalized to turn their perceived weaknesses into a formidable, if fragile, kind of power that shook the foundations of the Victorian home. The séance was never merely a gathering of the curious. It was a carefully constructed piece of immersive theater, a drama played out in the dark heart of the Victorian home. To understand the power of the movement, one must understand how the space was prepared. The staging of the invisible began with the physical transformation of the parlor. This was usually a room of domestic display, cluttered with velvet cushions, porcelain figurines, and heavy drapes. For the séance, this space was cleared and consecrated to the shadows. The seating was never accidental. Participants were arranged in a circle, often with men and women alternating to create what was termed a harmonious battery of psychic force. This gendered arrangement was believed to balance the positive and negative energies of the room. The lighting was the most critical element of the choreography. As the gas lights were hissed down to a low blue flicker or extinguished entirely, the familiar geometry of the room dissolved. In this manufactured twilight, the human eye becomes desperate for patterns, making every moving shadow a potential ghost. Many mediums introduce the cabinet, a small area partitioned off by heavy black curtains where the medium would sit. This served as a dark room for the spirits to condense their forms. The air was often primed with music, the singing of hymns or the soft playing of a music box, intended to harmonize the vibrations of the sitters. This sensory deprivation, combined with rhythmic sound, created a state of heightened suggestibility, turning a common room into a liminal space where the boundary between the physical and the spectral could be breached at any moment. Every creak of the floorboard and every rustle of a curtain was no longer a mundane noise. It was a scripted event in a supernatural play. As the movement matured, the intimate domestic gathering began to evolve into a professionalized industry. The parlor was no longer just a site of mourning. It became a site of entrepreneurship. What began as a local curiosity quickly transformed into a commercial enterprise with its own marketing and subscription models. Professional mediums began to charge significant sums for their services, with prices often ranging from 5 shillings for a basic circle to a full guinea for a private sitting with a celebrated practitioner. This created a new class of parlor entrepreneurs who operated within a complex economic network. They were not merely spiritual guides. They were performers who had to manage their reputation and their brand in a competitive market. Advertising moved from word of mouth into the back pages of specialized journals like the Spiritual Magazine or Light, which functioned as trade publications for the supernatural. These advertisements offered a menu of services: table wrapping, trance oratory, or the production of spirit lights. The professionalization of the séance required a delicate balance. A medium had to appear humble and passive to maintain their spiritual authority, yet they had to be savvy enough to manage their bookings and travel schedules. This economy was fueled by the Victorian obsession with self-improvement and the desire for direct experience. People were willing to pay for the chance to witness a miracle in their own homes. This commercialization did not necessarily equate to fraud in the eyes of the believers. Instead, it was seen as a necessary exchange of value for the medium's exhausting labor. The medium was providing a service, a bridge to the afterlife, and in the marketplace of the mid-19th century, even the voices of the dead had a price tag. The success of these performances relied heavily on the psychological dynamics of the audience. A séance was a collective event, a shared emotional journey that bound the sitters together in a circle of expectation. The physical act of holding hands or touching fingers across a table created a sense of social pressure and shared responsibility. To break the circle was not just a technical failure, it was a social transgression, a betrayal of the group's shared hope. This created a powerful atmosphere of suggestibility. When one person in the darkened room whispered that they felt a cold breeze or a phantom touch, the sensation often rippled through the entire group like a contagion. This was the authority of the medium at work, not through direct command. but through the subtle manipulation of expectation. The medium acted as a director, guiding the collective attention toward specific points in the room. In this environment, the will to believe often overrode the capacity for critical observation. The emotional weight of grief provided a powerful lens that distorted reality. A mother who had lost a child was not looking for a trick. She was looking for her son. The shared emotion of the room acted as a lubricant for the miraculous, making the impossible seem not only plausible but inevitable. The audience was not a passive observer. They were an active component of the machinery of contact. Without their emotional investment and their willingness to participate in the ritual, the performance would have collapsed into a collection of clumsy thumps and rustling curtains. The séance was a psychological ecosystem where belief and spectacle fed upon one another. To see this theater in its highest form, we must reconstruct the sittings of the era's most famous practitioners, such as the enigmatic Daniel Douglas Home. Imagine a London townhouse in the 1860s. The guests are not commoners, but members of the aristocracy and men of science. The room is not pitch black, but bathed in the soft, uncertain light of a single shaded lamp. Home does not sit in a cabinet. He sits in the circle, his hands clearly visible on the table. The performance begins not with a rap, but with a physical sensation of the entire room vibrating, as if a great engine were running beneath the floorboards. The heavy mahogany table, which 3 men could barely lift, begins to tilt and then slowly rises several inches into the air, hovering with a strange, liquid grace. The sitters feel the touch of invisible hands, described as being firm, warm, and lifelike, yet dissolving into nothing when grasped. Bells placed on the floor begin to ring as if carried by a playful child. In one of his most celebrated feats, Home was said to levitate, his body rising from his chair and floating through the room in the near darkness. These sittings were masterpieces of pacing and atmosphere. Home understood the power of the understated. He did not flood the room with ghosts. He provided a series of elegant, inexplicable physical events that challenged the very laws of gravity and matter. These reconstructions show us that the high-stakes séances were not just about talking to the dead. They were about the absolute subversion of the physical world. For the witnesses, these were not parlor tricks. They were empirical evidence of a higher reality, staged with a sophistication that left even the most hardened skeptics feeling a cold prickle of doubt. As the century progressed, the séance could no longer be contained within the private parlor. The demand for these experiences was too great, leading to the scaling of the spectacle from the home to the public hall and the theater. This transition fundamentally changed the nature of the practice. In a private home, the séance was an intimate, participatory ritual. In a public hall, it became a spectator sport. Mediums like the Davenport brothers toured the country with a massive, specially constructed wooden cabinet. They would be bound with ropes by a committee of local skeptics. Yet once the cabinet doors were closed, musical instruments inside would play and phantom hands would reach out through small windows. This was a move from the domestic to the industrial. The scale changed the implications of the events. Thousands of people would pack into theaters to watch a medium perform, turning the communion with the dead into a night's entertainment alongside singers and acrobats. This migration to the public stage invited a new level of scrutiny, and a new kind of competition. Magicians like John Neville Maskelyne began to incorporate spiritualist effects into their own shows, not to prove the existence of spirits, but to expose the methods of the mediums through superior stagecraft. The scaling of the spectacle made the movement more visible and more profitable, but it also stripped away the protective layer of domestic privacy. The parlor had been a sanctuary. The stage was a battlefield. This shift marked the beginning of a new era where the séance was no longer a secret whisper between loved ones, but a loud, contested claim in the noisy marketplace of the modern world. The theater of the spirit had become a public spectacle, and the world was watching with both wonder and a growing, sharp-edged cynicism. By the middle of the 19th century, the Victorian world was undergoing a revolution in how it perceived reality. For centuries, the human eye was the ultimate arbiter of truth, yet it was known to be fallible, prone to exhaustion, and easily deceived by the flickering shadows of a candlelit room. The arrival of the camera changed everything. Photography was not merely a new art form. It was hailed as the pencil of nature. It was an objective, mechanical, and chemical process that seemed to strip away human bias. To the Victorian mind, the camera did not interpret the world, it witnessed it. When a photograph was taken, the light itself etched the truth onto a silver-coated plate. This created a new evidence regime, where a physical image was considered far more authoritative than the testimony of 1,000 witnesses. It was in this atmosphere of scientific optimism that the most startling development of the spiritualist movement occurred. If the spirits truly inhabited our physical space, and if the camera could capture the subtle vibrations of light that the human eye missed, then it was only logical that the dead should appear on film. Spirit photography was born from this intersection of industrial technology and ancient longing. It promised to do what no priest or philosopher had ever achieved: to provide an empirical, visible, and undeniable portrait of the soul. For a society obsessed with cataloging the world, the prospect of cataloging the afterlife was the ultimate frontier. To understand why these images were so convincing, we must look at the grueling and almost alchemical techniques required to produce a photograph in the 1860s. This was the era of the wet plate collodion process, a method that required the photographer to be as much a chemist as an artist. A glass plate was coated in a volatile mixture of collodion, then sensitized in a bath of silver nitrate in total darkness. The plate had to be rushed into the camera, exposed while still damp, and then immediately developed before the chemicals dried. This process was messy, unpredictable, and prone to 1,000 different technical artifacts. To the uninitiated, a streak of light caused by a chemical leak or a faint smudge from an improperly cleaned plate could easily be interpreted as a divine manifestation. The most common technique for producing an intentional spirit was the double exposure. A photographer would expose a plate briefly to a figure wrapped in white silk, then use that same plate to photograph the actual client. The result was a solid, living person accompanied by a transparent, hovering ghost. Another method involved using a small, pre-prepared glass slide with a spirit image on it, which was placed in the camera just in front of the main plate. This ghost in the machine allowed the photographer to produce consistent results. While these methods seem transparent to us today, We must remember that the average Victorian had no concept of how a photograph was made. To them, the dark room was a place of mystery, and the emergence of a face from a bath of clear liquid was nothing short of a miracle. The public reaction to these images was a tidal wave of both ecstatic belief and ferocious condemnation. The most famous case was that of William Mumler, an American engraver who accidentally captured a spirit on a self-portrait and soon became the first professional spirit photographer. His most iconic image was a portrait of Mary Todd Lincoln, the widow of the assassinated president. In the photograph, a pale, solemn Abraham Lincoln stands behind his wife, his ghostly hands resting gently on her shoulders. For Mary, a woman drowning in a sea of grief and public scrutiny, this image was a lifeline. It was not just a picture, it was a physical confirmation that her husband still watched over her. When the photograph circulated, it provoked a frenzy. In Britain, practitioners like Frederick Hudson began to produce similar results, often under the watchful eyes of skeptical committees. The tension was palpable. For every believer who saw a miracle, there was a photographer who saw a crime. The debate played out in the courtroom and the press. During Mumler's famous trial for fraud in 1869, even the great Barnum testified against him. Yet, the prosecution could not prove how he did it, and Mumler was acquitted. This victory bolstered the movement, as believers argued that if the law and science could not explain the images, then they must be real. The visual turn had succeeded in moving the debate from the subjective feeling of the séance to the objective reality of the printed card. This new visual evidence quickly birthed a lucrative and widespread market for images. The Victorian era was the age of the carte de visite, small and inexpensive photographs that were traded like calling cards. This format was the perfect vehicle for spirit photography. For a few shillings, a grieving father could obtain a small card that fit perfectly into a pocketbook or a family album. These images became commodities of consolation. They were sold in spiritualist bookshops, advertised in broadsheets, and reprinted in journals. This was the commercialization of the ghost. Large publishing houses began to issue collections of spirit photographs as books, treating them with the same gravity as a botanical or architectural survey. These reprints allowed the phenomenon to reach those who could not afford a private sitting. It created a shared visual vocabulary of the afterlife. People began to expect their dead to look a certain way, and photographers were happy to oblige. The supply chains for these images were extensive, moving from city studios to rural parishes. A single successful spirit photo could be reprinted thousands of times, becoming a permanent fixture in the visual landscape of the century. The dead were no longer just memories. They were a collectible, tradable part of the burgeoning image economy. The visual aesthetics of these photographs were deeply tied to the cultural expectations of the time. Why did the spirits look like they were made of mist? Or why were they so often shrouded in white? This look was not accidental. It matched the Victorian concept of the liminal. A spirit was supposed to be halfway between matter and energy, and the blurred, pale, and half-formed figures in the photographs perfectly captured this state of being. The use of white drapery or cotton wool to represent ectoplasm became a standard visual shorthand. These aesthetics were reinforced by the popular literature and ghost stories of the era, creating a feedback loop between fiction and photography. if a spirit photo had been too sharp or too clear, it might have been less believable. The blurriness allowed the viewer's own imagination to fill in the details, often leading them to recognize a face that was, in reality, quite generic. This pallor and lack of definition served as a psychological bridge. It suggested that the spirit world was a reflection of our own, yet softened by the passage through the veil. The visual turn turned the afterlife into an aesthetic experience, one that was both hauntingly beautiful and comfortably familiar. It gave a face to the void, even if that face was only a smear of silver and light. However, the very technology that bolstered the faith of millions also provided the tools for its undoing. As the century drew to a close, photography became more accessible to the public, and with that accessibility came a deeper understanding of its limitations and its capacity for deception. Skeptical photographers and amateur hobbyists began to conduct their own experiments, demonstrating how easily a ghost could be manufactured in a common darkroom. They published manuals on how to spot a fake, pointing out things like inconsistent lighting on the spirit versus the sitter, or the telltale edges of a cutout figure. In some cases, the exposure was even more dramatic. In 1875, the famous French medium Edouard Bouguer was arrested, and he confessed in open court that his spirit photographs were nothing but clever double exposures using dolls and studio assistants. He even demonstrated his techniques for the judge. These confessions and technical exposures created a crisis of evidence. The camera, which had been the ultimate witness, was now revealed to be a potential liar. This did not end the practice of spirit photography, but it forced it to retreat from the mainstream of scientific curiosity back into the private circles of the devoted. The limits of the medium had been reached. The visual turn had promised a world of certainty, but it had ultimately delivered a world of mirrors. The photograph remained a powerful object of memory, but it could no longer claim to be a cold, hard fact. The battle for the truth had moved beyond the lens, leaving behind a legacy of beautiful, haunting, and deeply human illusions. The late Victorian era was defined by a profound intellectual crisis that shook the very foundations of the Western mind. As the 1870s gave way to the 1880s, the battle between traditional religious faith and the surging tide of Darwinian materialism reached a fever pitch. In the hallowed halls of Cambridge and London, a generation of thinkers found themselves stranded in a spiritual no man's land. They could no longer accept the literal dogmas of the church, yet they were equally repelled by a cold, mechanical universe that reduced the human soul to a mere byproduct of chemical reactions. It was out of this deep existential yearning for a third way that the Society for Psychical Research was born in 1882. This was not a gathering of occultists or wide-eyed enthusiasts. It was a mobilization of the era's most formidable minds. Henry Sidgwick, a moral philosopher of legendary caution; Frederick Myers, a classical scholar of immense poetic sensitivity; and Edmund Gurney, a polymath obsessed with the nature of human experience. Their mission was as audacious as it was simple: to bring the cold, impartial light of scientific method to the dark corners of the séance room. They sought to determine, once and for all, if the strange phenomena of spiritualism were a new frontier of physics, or merely a massive collective delusion. The formation of the Society for Psychical Research marked the transition of spiritualism from a domestic pastime into an institutionalized field of study. The investigators realized that the anecdotal evidence of the parlour was insufficient to convince a skeptical world. To meet the standards of the Royal Society, they had to transform the séance into a laboratory experiment. This required a radical reimagining of the conditions of contact. They began by establishing a rigorous taxonomy of phenomena, distinguishing between physical effects like table turning and mental effects like telepathy or clairvoyance. Their early work, published in the massive 2-volume study titled Phantasms of the Living, involved the collection and meticulous verification of thousands of first-hand accounts of apparitions. They acted as supernatural detectives, interviewing witnesses, checking weather reports, and verifying timestamps to see if a reported ghost coincided with a real-world death. This was science as a massive data harvesting operation. They were not just looking for a single miracle. They were looking for a statistical anomaly that could not be explained by chance or fraud. When the society moved into the investigation of physical mediums, the atmosphere shifted from the library to the examination room. The protocols they developed were designed to strip the medium of every possible advantage. They used the technology of the industrial age to entrap the spirits. Mediums were often required to perform in specialized laboratories where their movements could be tracked by mechanical means. One of the most famous apparatuses was the galvanometer, a device used to measure minute electrical currents. By making the medium part of a low-voltage circuit, the investigators could detect if they moved their hands or feet even a fraction of an inch to produce a fraudulent rap or tilt a table. They used weighing machines to see if the medium's body weight changed during a materialization, and they employed early flash photography to capture the sudden, fleeting manifestations of ectoplasm. These sittings were often grueling and adversarial. The medium was no longer a guest in a home, but a subject under a microscope, surrounded by men of science who were trained to spot the slightest hint of muscular contraction or hidden mechanical assistance. Perhaps the most significant case in the Society's history was that of Leonora Piper, a medium from Boston who became known as the White Crow. William James, the father of American psychology and a key collaborator with the Society, famously remarked that to upset the law that all crows are black, it is enough to produce a single white crow. For the investigators, Leonora Piper was that crow. Unlike the flashy theatrical mediums of the London stage, Piper worked in a state of quiet, profound trance, producing automatic writing and speech that contained specific, verifiable information about the lives of the sitters that she could not have possibly known through normal means. For decades, the Society subjected her to the most intense scrutiny imaginable. They followed her, hired private detectives to watch her, and introduced her to anonymous sitters from across the Atlantic. Yet Piper never failed. She provided names, dates, and intimate secrets that left even the most hardened skeptics in a state of bewildered awe. Her case shifted the Society's focus away from physical tricks and toward the deeper mysteries of the human mind and the possibility of a survival of consciousness that did not rely on heavy furniture or gauzy materializations. As the investigators spent more time in the presence of mediums, they began to develop a new vocabulary for the human psyche. Frederick Myers, in particular, realized that much of what was being attributed to spirits might actually be the work of the subconscious. He coined the term the subliminal self to describe a vast hidden reservoir of the mind that processed information beneath the level of conscious awareness. This was a revolutionary concept that predated and influenced the work of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Myers suggested that a medium's trance allowed this subliminal self to emerge, drawing on forgotten memories, subtle sensory cues, and perhaps even a form of telepathic resonance with the sitters. This psychological turn provided a way to respect the genuineness of the medium's experience without necessarily accepting the spirit hypothesis. It reframed the séance as an exploration of the inner space of the human brain. The ghost was not in the room. It was in the basement of the mind. This shift in perspective allowed the society to maintain its scientific credibility while continuing to investigate the most profound questions of human existence. Another fascinating and complex chapter in the society's history was the study of the cross correspondences. Following the deaths of several founding members, including Myers and Sidgwick, a group of automatic writers in different parts of the world began to receive fragments of messages that, on their own, made no sense. It was only when the society's investigators brought these fragments together that they formed coherent scholarly puzzles based on obscure classical texts that only the deceased founders would have known. It was as if the dead scholars were conducting their own experiment from the other side, providing a form of evidence that was so complex and so intellectual that it could not be explained by the medium's own knowledge or simple telepathy. The cross correspondences remain one of the most intriguing and debated pieces of evidence in the history of psychical research, representing a literalized version of the celestial telegraph that the early spiritualists had imagined decades before. Despite these intellectual triumphs, the Society for Psychical Research faced constant, bruising conflict with the broader scientific establishment. The mainstream of Victorian science, led by figures like Thomas Huxley and John Tyndall, viewed the Society's work as a betrayal of reason. They argued that by even investigating these claims, the Society was giving them a legitimacy they did not deserve. The scientists of the SPR were often mocked in the press and faced professional isolation. They were caught in a perpetual crossfire. Believers found them too skeptical and cold, while the materialists found them too credulous and soft. This tension highlighted the fundamental difficulty of applying scientific standards to a phenomenon that was, by its very nature, subjective and elusive. The laboratory demands reproducibility and control, but the séance was a unique, emotional, and often chaotic event. This friction produced a body of work that was both brilliantly analytical and deeply frustrated, a testament to the limits of the Victorian scientific project when confronted with the mystery of death. The legacy of the Society for Psychical Research is not found in a definitive proof of the afterlife, but in the creation of a new kind of inquiry. They pioneered the study of what we now call parapsychology, and their work on telepathy, hypnosis, and the subconscious helped to birth the modern science of psychology. They proved that the human experience is far wider and more mysterious than a purely materialistic worldview can account for. By treating the claims of spiritualists with serious, sustained attention, they force the world to look at the boundaries of knowledge They documented the incredible capacity of the human mind for both deception and extraordinary perception. Even today, the Society continues its work in London, maintaining a vast archive of human longing and unexplained events. They stand as a bridge between the Victorian age of spirits and the modern age of neuroscience, reminding us that the search for the soul is not a sign of weakness, but one of the most persistent and defining characteristics of the human intellect. As the 19th century drew to a close, the work of the SPR had successfully moved the conversation away from the crude, physical manifestations of the early movement toward a more sophisticated psychological understanding of the spirit. The raps and table tilts were increasingly seen as relics of a more primitive era of the craze. The focus was now on the information conveyed, the personality revealed, and the intricate workings of the trance state. This maturation of the movement, however, did not mean the end of the controversy. If anything, the involvement of the scientific elite only raised the stakes. The battle for the definition of truth had become more refined, more technical, and more global. The world was about to enter a new century, one that would bring even greater technologies of contact and even more profound challenges to the human spirit. The investigations of the SPR had prepared the ground, showing that while the ghosts might remain in the shadows, the human need to reach out to them was a fact that science could no longer afford to ignore. Ultimately, the Society for Psychical Research represented the Victorian mind at its most courageous and its most vulnerable. They were men and women who were willing to risk their reputations to explore a possibility that most of their peers found ridiculous or dangerous. They navigated a world of shadows with the tools of reason, trying to build a bridge of evidence where before there had only been a gulf of faith. Their thousands of pages of reports and meticulously recorded sittings remain a haunting monument to a time when humanity believed that the secrets of the universe could be unlocked by a patient observer in a darkened room. They showed that the line between the natural and the supernatural is not a wall, but a shifting frontier, and that the greatest mystery of all is not what lies beyond the grave, but what lies within the untapped depths of the living human mind. The table had been weighed, the medium had been searched, and the light of science had been cast into the void. The results were inconclusive, but the journey had transformed the way we understand ourselves forever. The history of Victorian spiritualism contains a recurring pattern of deception and subsequent discovery. For decades, the movement thrived on the production of physical miracles. Yet these very miracles often proved to be the work of earthly hands. Fraud was an ever-present reality within the high-stakes environment of the séance. The medium's entire reputation rested on their ability to manifest the impossible. If the spirits failed to appear or the table remained motionless, the medium faced professional ruin and social disgrace. In the heavy, expectant silence of a darkened room, the temptation to provide a manufactured sign became a common survival strategy. The manufactured darkness and the heightened emotional state of the participants provided an ideal setting for the development of sophisticated tricks. Exposure was a constant threat, capable of turning a celebrated visionary into a public laughingstock in a single moment of clarity. The most significant blow to the movement's reputation came from its founders. On a cold October night in 1888, the Brooklyn Academy of Music hosted a crowd of thousands who had come to witness a total reversal of faith. Margaret Fox, one of the sisters whose childhood raps in New York had initiated the global movement, appeared on stage in a state of deep distress. She was accompanied by her sister Kate, who stood by in silent support. Margaret was motivated by a mixture of financial desperation, struggles with alcohol, and a heavy conscience. She made a public confession that fundamentally altered the public's perception of the spirit world. She demonstrated how the original raps were created. She removed her shoe and placed her foot on a wooden board. Through a series of sharp, rhythmic movements of her toe joints, she produced the exact sounds that had convinced millions of the presence of the dead. She explained that it had begun as a childhood prank to frighten their mother and had spiraled out of control as they were pressured by their older sister, Leah. This revelation was a massive shock to the cultural landscape. For the faithful, it was a profound tragedy. For critics, it was the final evidence that spiritualism was built on a foundation of lies. Although Margaret tried to retract her statement later when she needed money, the damage was done. The image of the snapping toe became a permanent symbol of the movement's inherent deception. Beyond the simple raps of the Fox sisters, the methods of fraud became increasingly complex as the public demanded more spectacular events. Mediums were forced to become inventors and magicians to maintain their popularity. The tools of the fraudulent medium were examples of Victorian mechanical creativity. Telescopic reaching rods were hidden in sleeves or walking sticks to move objects or touch participants from across the room. Small, concealed bellows created the cold drafts often reported as spirit breezes. Phosphorus was used to create spirit lights or phantom hands that glowed with an unearthly light. Even the furniture was part of the act. Many mediums used metal hooks on their wrists or knees to lift heavy tables while keeping their hands visible. The spirit cabinet, intended to concentrate psychic energy, was actually a repository for hidden compartments. In these spaces, a medium could hide wigs, masks, and layers of thin fabric used to represent the bodies of the dead. These physical objects were the hidden machinery of the séance, turning a spiritual gathering into a high-stakes performance of sleight of hand. The production of ectoplasm was perhaps the most visceral and unsettling form of deception. This substance was described by believers as the physical manifestation of spirit energy. But when it was examined closely, it often proved to be something far more mundane. In many cases of exposure, ectoplasm was revealed to be strips of muslin, chiffon, or simple cheesecloth. Some mediums would swallow large amounts of this material before a sitting and then regurgitate it in the dark to make it appear as though it were flowing from their mouths or nostrils. Others used animal tissues or a mixture of soap and egg whites. These materials were often treated with chemicals to make them glow. The discovery of these materials was a frequent source of scandal. When a skeptical participant would break the circle and grab the supposed spirit matter, they were often left holding a damp piece of household cloth. The realization that a divine manifestation was made of cheap fabric was a significant blow to the movement's dignity. It reduced a sacred experience to a crude parlor trick and transformed a holy moment into a display of physical deception. Another prevalent method was slate writing. where spirits supposedly wrote messages on the inside of a sealed slate. Mediums like Henry Slade became famous for this ability. Investigators eventually discovered that the mediums were incredibly skilled at swapping slates, or using a tiny piece of pencil attached to a thimble or ring. This allowed them to write messages while the slate was held under a table or behind a curtain. The messages were often vague or used common platitudes that could apply to anyone. Yet the emotional impact on a grieving sitter was immense. The idea that a loved one could write a physical letter from beyond the grave was so powerful that many people ignored the obvious signs of mechanical interference. The use of spirit trumpets, which supposedly floated through the air to amplify the voices of the dead, was another popular technique. In reality, the medium or an accomplice would simply move the trumpet through the air using a rod and whisper into it. The darkness allowed these simple physical actions to be perceived as supernatural events. One of the most complex scandals involved Florence Cook and the materialization of the spirit Katie King. Florence was the first medium in England to claim a spirit could appear as a fully formed human being who could be touched and heard. She was famously endorsed by the scientist Sir William Crookes. However, the performance was under constant threat from skeptics. In 1874, William Volkmann, convinced the spirit was actually the medium in disguise, lunged at the figure of Katie King. During a struggle in the darkness, Volkmann claimed he had captured a solid woman who looked exactly like Florence Cook and smelled of her perfume. Although the lights were quickly extinguished and the medium was found bound in her cabinet, the reputation of the sittings was ruined. This incident created a lasting scandal for Sir William Crookes, whose professional reputation was damaged by his defense of the medium. Critics argued he had been blinded by an emotional attachment to Florence Cook. This case highlighted the erotic and physical nature of the séance, where the proximity of the participants created a space where boundaries were easily crossed. Magicians became the most effective enemies of the spiritualist movement. Men like John Neville Maskelyne and Harry Houdini viewed mediums as dishonest competitors who exploited the vulnerable. They understood the limitations of human perception and the mechanics of stage magic. Houdini was particularly aggressive in his exposures. He attended séances in various disguises and used his knowledge of escapes and illusions to catch mediums in the act. He used hidden torches to illuminate the room at critical moments, showing mediums standing on furniture or waving props. Houdini would then reproduce these effects on his own stage, demonstrating that they were entirely physical. This created a public conflict between those who claimed to see the invisible and those who knew how to make things vanish. Houdini's work made it increasingly difficult for mediums to operate without being accused of simple trickery. He turned the search for the supernatural into a contest of technical skill. Despite repeated exposures, the movement remained resilient due to the development of specific rationalizations. Believers argued that many mediums were mixed mediums, people with genuine gifts who resorted to trickery when their powers were weak. This allowed the faithful to ignore fraud as a temporary character flaw rather than a systematic lie. They even suggested that spirits themselves might trick the sitters to test their faith or punish their doubt. This psychological loop made the movement very difficult to criticize from the outside. For many, the emotional comfort of the séance was more important than the technical evidence of fraud. They were willing to overlook cheesecloth and hidden rods if they could believe they had heard a familiar voice. The paradox of the believer was the ability to accept both the fraud and the miracle at the same time. This internal defense mechanism kept the movement alive even as its most famous figures were exposed as performers. The social and legal consequences of exposure were significant. For a medium, being caught was a total destruction of their social status. Many were forced to leave their homes and live in poverty. Some were prosecuted under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which categorized spirit communication as a form of fortune-telling intended to deceive. These trials were public events that provided newspapers with material for mockery. The fall of a medium served as a warning to the public about the dangers of alternative spiritualities. The domestic parlor was transformed from a place of hope into a site of suspicion and shame. The history of fraud shows how easily the desire for consolation could be exploited by those who understood the theater of the spirit. It serves as a reminder that the obstacles to finding the truth are often found in the actions of those who claim to have the answers. The era of scandal led to a clear separation between the occult and mainstream society. As the 20th century approached, the public became more skeptical and the technology of detection improved. The legal risks became too high for many practitioners to continue. However, the legacy of these scandals is a central part of the spiritualist story. It shows the lengths people go to find comfort and the complexity of the relationship between faith and facts. The exposures changed the nature of the movement, pushing it into more private, cautious circles. The sounds of snapping toes and the sight of hidden fabrics remain part of the history, showing that the most persistent ghosts are the ones created by human hands. The battle between the medium and the skeptic was a battle for the definition of truth in an age that was rapidly changing. It was a struggle to find meaning in a world where the lines between the natural and the supernatural were being rewritten every day. The scandals proved that while the spirits might be illusions, the human need for them was a very real force. The psychological impact on the mediums themselves was also profound. Many lived double lives, existing as holy figures in the evening and as technical performers in the morning. This duality often led to mental strain and ethical confusion. Some mediums eventually came to believe their own deceptions, convinced that their tricks were merely a way to help the spirits manifest. This self-deception added another layer to the complexity of the movement. The scandals were not just about money. They were about the human capacity for belief and the desperate search for connection in an increasingly industrial world. The history of spiritualist fraud is a history of the human heart's vulnerability to hope. Each exposure revealed a piece of the machinery, but it could never quite erase the desire for the miracle. The movement evolved to survive these scandals, becoming more careful and more hidden. But the memory of the great exposures remained a cautionary tale for generations to come. The Victorian era existed in a state of constant proximity to death. Mortality was a visible and frequent occurrence that touched every level of society, from the crowded urban slums to the expansive country estates of the nobility. Death rates remained high throughout the 19th century, particularly among children and infants. Many families experienced the loss of multiple children before they reached school age. Infectious diseases such as cholera, typhus, and smallpox could sweep through a household in days, leaving the survivors in a state of sudden and overwhelming shock. This environmental reality produced a culture that was uniquely focused on the management of grief and the preservation of memory. Death was a public and communal event that required specific social performances and symbols. The Victorian response to loss was characterized by an intense focus on ritual and the creation of physical reminders of the deceased. This cultural climate provided the foundation for the spiritualist movement as people sought new ways to maintain a connection with those they had lost. Queen Victoria served as the primary architect of the nation's mourning customs. Following the death of Prince Albert in 1861, the Queen entered a period of mourning that lasted for the rest of her life. She wore black for 40 years and maintained Albert's private rooms as if he were still alive, with fresh water and clean clothes laid out daily. This royal example transformed personal sorrow into a national standard of conduct. Her prolonged grief made the elaborate rituals of mourning a requirement for social respectability. The Queen's influence helped to establish a strict timeline for mourning that dictated everything from the color of one's clothing to the types of social events one could attend. This society became highly attuned to the visual signals of loss. The presence of black fabric or a specific type of jewelry communicated a person's place within the mourning cycle. This environment made the claims of spiritualism appear to be a logical extension of a life already defined by the presence of the dead. The material culture of mourning was an expensive and demanding part of Victorian life. For women, the rules of dress were exceptionally rigid. During the period of deep mourning, which lasted for a year and a day, a widow was expected to wear dull black fabrics like bombazine or Parramatta silk. These were covered in heavy layers of crepe, a silk fabric that had been heat-treated to create a scratchy, matte texture. Crepe was notoriously uncomfortable and could cause skin irritation or respiratory issues due to the dyes used in its manufacture. As time passed, a woman moved into second mourning, where the crepe was removed and slightly more reflective fabrics were permitted. The final stage was half mourning, which allowed for colors such as lavender, mauve, and gray. Men had fewer requirements, typically wearing black suits and gloves with a black band around their hats. These garments served as a social barrier, protecting the mourner from the expectations of the outside world. The cost of these clothes was a significant burden for the poor, leading to a massive industry in secondhand mourning clothes and the dyeing of everyday garments. The concept of the good death was a central obsession of the Victorian period. This ideal, rooted in the ancient tradition of the ars moriendi, required a person to be conscious and spiritually prepared at the moment of their passing. A good death occurred at home, surrounded by family members who would listen to the final words and observe the dying person's state of mind. This process allowed the survivors to feel a sense of closure and to believe that the soul was departing for a better place. However, the industrial age often made this ideal impossible to achieve. Many people died suddenly in factory accidents on distant battlefields or alone in hospital wards. The lack of a proper goodbye was a source of deep psychological distress for many families. Spiritualism addressed this trauma by promising a second chance at communication. Through a medium, a mother could hear the final messages her son never got to deliver. The seance room functioned as a space where the interrupted connection between the living and the dead could be restored, and the ritual of the good death could be completed. In the absence of a living presence, Victorians created complex memento mori to keep the dead within the family circle. Post-mortem photography became a popular way to preserve the image of a lost loved one. Because professional photography was still relatively rare and expensive, many families did not possess a single image of a child or spouse while they were alive. When death occurred, a photographer was hired to take a final portrait of the body. These images were often carefully staged to make the deceased appear as though they were sleeping or resting comfortably. Sometimes the bodies were posed in chairs or held by parents to create a more lifelike appearance. While these photographs can seem unsettling today, they were cherished possessions for Victorians. They provided the only physical proof that a person had existed and were kept in honored places within the home. These images represented a refusal to let the dead be forgotten by the passage of time. Hair jewelry was another deeply personal form of remembrance used during this era. Hair was valued because it did not decay and was believed to carry the physical essence of the individual. When a person died, locks of their hair were collected and woven into intricate patterns. This hair was used to create rings, brooches, watch chains, and even large framed artworks. Some designs featured weeping willows or funeral urns made entirely of human hair. Wearing a piece of hair jewelry allowed a person to maintain a literal physical connection with the deceased throughout the day. This practice was so widespread that professional hair weavers were a common sight in Victorian cities, and instructions for hair work were included in women's magazines. This physical intimacy with the remains of the dead shows the intense need for contact that characterized Victorian grief. It was the same desire for tangible evidence that made the physical manifestations of the seance room so appealing to the public. The geography of burial underwent a major change as cities became more crowded. The old parish churchyards became overfilled and unsanitary, leading to the creation of large garden cemeteries on the outskirts of major cities. Locations like Highgate in London or Greenwood in New York were designed as beautiful landscapes with winding paths, exotic trees, and elaborate monuments. These cemeteries were intended to be places of public recreation as well as burial. Families would spend their Sundays walking through the grounds and visiting the graves of their relatives. The monuments in these cemeteries were often massive works of art, featuring Gothic chapels, Egyptian obelisks, and marble angels. This architecture reflected a desire to give the dead a permanent and prestigious home. The cemetery functioned as a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, allowing for a state of peaceful coexistence. This aesthetic approach to death helped to make the idea of the afterlife feel more accessible and less frightening. Spiritualism complemented this change in burial practices by providing a detailed description of the afterlife. Through mediumistic messages, a clear vision of the spirit world emerged, often called the Summerland. This place was described as a beautiful landscape of eternal spring, where the dead continue to live in homes, wear clothes, and pursue their interests. The Summerland was not a place of judgment or punishment. It was a refined version of a Victorian suburb. Spirits reported that they were reunited with their families and even their pets. This domestic vision of the afterlife was extremely comforting to a society that valued family bonds above all else. It transformed the mystery of death into a familiar and welcoming environment. The messages from the Summerland reassured the grieving that their loved ones were safe and were still interested in the daily lives of those they left behind. This belief changed the nature of mourning as people began to view death as a temporary separation rather than a final end. The business of death was a significant part of the Victorian economy. The mourning trade was a massive commercial enterprise that provided everything a bereaved family could possibly need. Large department stores, such as Jay's Mourning Warehouse in London, were dedicated entirely to funeral goods. They sold black bordered paper, specialized umbrellas, jet jewelry, and handkerchiefs edged in black. Undertakers became professional directors of grief, managing every detail of the funeral procession. These events were often highly theatrical, featuring horse-drawn hearses with black plumes and professional mutes who were paid to stand in silent mourning. The commercialization of grief ensured that even in their deepest sorrow, families were expected to participate in a consumer culture that measured the depth of their loss by the amount they spent. This economic pressure made the outward signs of memory a matter of public social standing and obligation. The Victorian culture of memory was a system designed to contain the chaotic power of loss. It provided a framework of rituals and objects that allowed people to navigate the difficult process of mourning. Spiritualism was the most interactive part of the system. It offered more than just symbols. It promised a living presence that could be felt and heard. By claiming that the dead could still communicate, the movement provided a powerful defense against the silence of the grave. It turned the memory of a loved one into an active and evolving relationship. This focus on the survival of the individual personality helped to change the cultural perception of mortality. The legacy of this period is still visible in the way we use photographs and keep mementos of the dead today. The Victorians taught the modern world that grief should be integrated into daily life rather than hidden away. The psychological impact of this focus on memory was immense. It allowed people to maintain a sense of continuity during a century that was characterized by rapid and often frightening change. In a world of increasing industrialization and urban isolation, the rituals of the séance and the preservation of a lock of hair provided a sense of grounded human connection. This culture was a response to the perceived coldness of the modern age. It insisted that every life had intrinsic value and that no one was truly lost to the past. The massive monuments in the cemeteries and the quiet conversations in the séance room were all part of a collective effort to keep the human spirit visible in the face of death. This was a society that chose to live in a constant dialogue with its own dead. The echoes of that dialogue remind us that the work of mourning is an ongoing process, and that the bonds of affection are what truly bridge the gap between the two worlds. The material landscape of Victorian death remains a distinctive feature of the 19th century. Every object used in the mourning process carried a specific meaning and served a social purpose. The black fabric, the hair wreaths, the post-mortem photos, and the spirit messages were all part of a shared language used to express the deepest human emotions. This language allowed Victorians to discuss death with a level of detail and openness that is often missing from contemporary life. They confronted mortality directly and turned it into an art, a science, and a spiritual practice. Their actions represent a human response to the universal experience of loss. They show that how we choose to remember the dead reflects the values we hold as the living. The Victorian culture of memory was a testament to the power of hope and the drive to find meaning in the shadow of the grave. The movement from the ritual of the morning dress to the hope of the summerland was a journey toward understanding the permanence of the human connection. The mid-19th century witnessed a media revolution that fundamentally altered how information was consumed and validated. This era saw the birth of the penny press, a new form of journalism that prioritized speed, sensationalism, and wide circulation over the sober analysis of the traditional elite broadsheets. As spiritualism began its rapid ascent, it found a perfect partner in this burgeoning media ecosystem. The movement and the modern press grew up together, feeding off one another in a symbiotic relationship. Newspapers needed the shocking, supernatural headlines to sell copies to an increasingly literate working class, and spiritualism needed the massive reach of the printing press to transform local parlor tricks into a global religious phenomenon. This was a period where the boundary between news and entertainment was becoming increasingly porous, and the market for miracles became one of the most profitable sectors of the publishing industry. The steam-powered printing press was the primary engine behind this expansion. It allowed for the production of thousands of copies per hour, making newspapers and pamphlets affordable for almost everyone. This technological leap meant that a report of a séance in New York could be reprinted, discussed, and debated in London or Paris within a matter of weeks. The sheer volume of printed material created a sense of overwhelming evidence. If dozens of different newspapers were reporting on the same supernatural events, it became harder for the average reader to dismiss them as mere local myths. The press acted as a massive amplifier, turning isolated events into a coherent national narrative. It also created a feedback loop where mediums would read about the latest successful techniques in the papers and incorporate them into their own performances, which would then be reported on again, creating an ever-expanding vocabulary of the paranormal. Central to this ecosystem were the dedicated spiritualist periodicals, which served as the intellectual and social glue of the movement. The most influential of these was The Banner of Light, published in Boston starting in 1857. This journal was a sophisticated operation that included a message department in every issue. In this section, the editors published transcripts of communications received from spirits through the paper's own resident mediums. These messages were often addressed to specific living individuals who would then write back to the paper to confirm the accuracy of the details. This created a participatory media experience that was entirely new. Readers did not just consume the news, they were part of the story. The Banner of Light functioned as a central clearinghouse for the dead, a printed version of the Celestial Telegraph that allowed for a continuous public dialogue between the two worlds. Other journals, like The Spiritualist in London and the Religio-Philosophical Journal in Chicago provided similar platforms, offering a mix of philosophical essays, scientific reports, and local news about the latest séances and exposures. The terminology of the Victorian media was often borrowed directly by the spiritualists to describe their experiences. The electric telegraph, which had revolutionized communication by sending messages through invisible wires, provided the perfect metaphor for spirit contact. People began to refer to mediums as human telegraphs and to the rappings as a form of celestial Morse code. This was a powerful rhetorical strategy. By framing the séance in the language of modern technology, spiritualists made their claims seem more plausible and less like traditional magic. If people could accept that a message could travel instantly across the Atlantic through a copper wire, it was not a massive leap to believe that a message could travel from the afterlife through a sensitive human nervous system. This technological branding helped the movement to shed its image as a relic of the past and to position itself as the religion of the future, a scientific faith that was perfectly in tune with the progress of the age. Beyond the dedicated journals, the secular press played a complex and often contradictory role in the market for miracles. Editors realized that stories about ghosts and mediums were guaranteed to drive circulation. Even the most skeptical papers would devote columns of space to detailed descriptions of séances, often illustrated with dramatic engravings. While the editorial tone might be one of mockery or caution, the vividness of the reporting often had the opposite effect, sparking the curiosity of the readers and encouraging them to seek out their own experiences. The new journalism of the 1880s, led by figures like W.T. Stead, took this a step further by embracing the supernatural as a legitimate subject for investigative reporting. Stead, who was a committed spiritualist himself, used his newspaper, the Pall Mall Gazette, to promote the movement and to conduct his own experiments with automatic writing. His involvement gave spiritualism a new level of mainstream visibility and intellectual weight, even as it drew fierce criticism from his more traditional colleagues. The commercialization of the movement was visible in the advertising columns of both spiritualist and secular newspapers. The market for miracles was a literal market, filled with products and services designed to facilitate contact with the dead. Mediums advertised their office hours and their prices for private sittings, often claiming specialties in business advice or medical diagnosis. Manufacturers sold a wide array of specialized equipment, spirit slates that were guaranteed not to be tampered with, planchettes for automatic writing, and psychic crystals for clairvoyance. There were even spirit lamps designed to provide the perfect low-light environment for a séance. This commercial infrastructure turned spiritualism into a consumer choice, a lifestyle that required a specific set of tools and a specific set of experts. The branding of these products often emphasized their scientific or patented nature, further blurring the line between religion and technology. This media environment also fostered a unique form of public debate. The letters to the editor sections of the 19th century press were a chaotic and vibrant public square where believers and skeptics fought for the soul of the movement. A single report of a séance could trigger weeks of correspondence, with readers providing their own theories, recounting their own experiences, and accusing the mediums of various forms of trickery. This democratic form of inquiry was essential to the growth of the movement. It allowed for a collective processing of the strange events being reported and gave ordinary people a voice in a conversation that had previously been the domain of the clergy or the scientific elite. The press made the supernatural a matter of public opinion, a subject that anyone with a pen and a stamp could contribute to. This accessibility was a key part of spiritualism's appeal, as it empowered the individual to judge the truth for themselves. The relationship between the press and the investigators of the Society for Psychical Research was particularly fraught. The Society's leaders often felt that the sensationalist reporting of the newspapers was the greatest obstacle to a truly scientific study of the phenomena. They complained that the press focused on the flashy and the fraudulent, ignoring the more subtle and potentially genuine cases. At the same time, they relied on the newspapers to bring new cases to their attention and to provide a platform for their own findings. This tension highlighted a fundamental conflict in the Victorian media ecosystem: the struggle between the need for accurate, measured information and the commercial demand for excitement and scandal. The market for miracles was often more interested in a good story than a boring truth, a reality that the scientists found deeply frustrating but impossible to escape. As the century drew to a close, the media's treatment of spiritualism began to change. The initial novelty had worn off, and the repeated exposures of famous mediums had made the public more cynical. The rise of cinema and other forms of mass entertainment provided new outlets for the human desire for wonder and spectacle. However, the media legacy of the movement remained. The techniques of sensationalist journalism, the use of celebrity endorsements, and the creation of participatory media networks were all refined during the spiritualist craze. The market for miracles had taught the press how to monetize the invisible and how to turn private grief into public consumption. This era proved that information was not just a collection of facts. It was a powerful social force that could create entire worlds of belief. The Victorian media ecosystem was a massive, decentralized laboratory where the boundaries of reality were constantly being tested and redefined. The newspapers and journals of the time did more than just report on the movement. They were the very air that it breathed. They provided the metaphors, the equipment, the audience, and the legitimacy that spiritualism needed to survive and thrive in a skeptical age. The history of the movement is inseparable from the history of the press, a reminder that what we believe is often shaped by the tools we use to communicate. The market for miracles was a testament to the enduring human need for wonder, a need that the Victorian media was only too happy to supply. The echoes of those printed messages and those sensational headlines still haunt our own media landscape, reminding us that the search for the unknown is always a profitable business. Ultimately, the media ecosystem of the 19th century created a world where the supernatural was a daily commodity. A person could read about a cabinet materialization over their morning coffee and purchase a planchette in the afternoon. This integration of the spirit world into the routine of the daily news made the afterlife feel like a tangible, accessible reality. The press didn't just document the miracles, it manufactured them, packaging the mysteries of the universe into digestible columns of print. This was the first truly modern information age, where the speed of the message was as important as the content. The spiritualists were the first to fully exploit this new reality, showing that in the world of mass media, a well-placed headline could be just as powerful as a well-timed rap on a table. The decline of Victorian spiritualism did not signify its total disappearance from the cultural landscape. By the early 20th century, the theatrical séances and the high-profile scandals had largely faded from the headlines. Yet the movement left behind a profound and permanent imprint on the Western mind. The legacies of spiritualism are found in the fundamental shifts it triggered in the realms of religious belief, the birth of modern psychology, and the ongoing struggle to define the boundaries of scientific inquiry. The movement acted as a catalyst for a new kind of individualistic spirituality that rejected traditional authority in the pursuit of personal experience. It provided the raw material for the first systematic explorations of the human unconscious. The long shadow of the séance room continues to influence how we understand the self, the afterlife, and the mysterious intersection of mind and matter. One of the most enduring legacies of spiritualism is the radical reimagining of the afterlife. Before the mid-19th century, Western views of the world beyond were dominated by Orthodox Christian concepts of judgment, heaven, and hell. Spiritualism replaced this binary system with the vision of the Summerland, a progressive and educational realm where every soul had the opportunity for growth. This shift represented a significant democratization of the divine. It removed the terror of eternal punishment and replaced it with a sense of continuity and hope. Spiritualism introduced a structured, multi-layered vision of existence after death that appealed to the Victorian sense of order and progress. This was the doctrine of the seven spheres, a celestial hierarchy where spirits moved from lower levels of ignorance to higher levels of wisdom. The Summerland was typically identified as the third sphere, a place of immense beauty that mirrored the best aspects of earthly life. In this realm, the dead were said to live in homes that reflected their moral character, surrounded by landscapes that were eternally blooming. Spirits reported that they continued to study in great libraries, attend lectures, and practice the arts. This was a vision of heaven that prioritized intellectual and emotional advancement over static worship. It turned the afterlife into a meritocracy of the soul, where the status of an individual was determined by their kindness and their pursuit of truth, rather than their adherence to a specific creed. This conceptual framework paved the way for modern secular and New Age views of the soul's journey, emphasizing a non-judgmental and supportive transition into the next phase of being. The scientific legacy of spiritualism is most clearly visible in the development of psychology and parapsychology. The investigators of the Society for Psychical Research, particularly Frederick Myers, were among the first to realize that many mediumistic phenomena were products of the hidden layers of the human mind. Myers' concept of the subliminal self provided a theoretical framework for understanding how the brain processes information beneath the level of conscious awareness. This work predated and influenced the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. The séance served as an early laboratory for the study of altered states of consciousness, dissociation, and the creative power of the imagination. Today, The study of psi phenomena continues as a niche but persistent field of scientific inquiry, exploring telepathy and precognition using rigorous statistical methods. The movement forced science to confront the subjective experience of the individual as a valid subject of study, leading to a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of human perception. The commitment of the society to data collection and the meticulous verification of testimony established a precedent for the qualitative research methods used in modern social sciences. Their archives remain a treasure trove for historians and psychologists seeking to understand the limits of human belief and the mechanisms of self-deception. Spiritualism also left a lasting mark on the history of social reform. The movement provided a unique platform for women and marginalized groups to claim a public voice at a time when they were largely excluded from traditional power structures. Because the authority of the medium came from the spirits rather than from institutional training, women were able to act as leaders, teachers, and political activists within the spiritualist community. Many prominent mediums were also vocal supporters of abolitionism, temperance, and women's suffrage. Figures like Emma Hardinge Britten used their status as trance speakers to deliver powerful orations on the rights of the laboring classes and the necessity of universal education. The séance room was a space where the social hierarchy could be temporarily suspended, allowing for a form of radical equality. This legacy of empowerment contributed to the broader movements for civil rights and gender equality that would define the 20th century. The spiritualist emphasis on individual authority and the rejection of dogma encouraged a spirit of dissent that remains a core value in many modern social justice movements. It created a blueprint for how alternative spiritual communities could challenge the status quo and provide a sense of belonging to those rejected by the mainstream. The influence of spiritualism experienced a powerful resurgence during and after the First and Second World Wars. The scale of the loss during these conflicts was so immense that traditional religious and social structures often failed to provide adequate comfort. Millions of grieving families turned once again to the promise of the séance to find closure and to hear a final message from sons and husbands who had disappeared into the chaos of the trenches. Figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle became tireless crusaders for the movement during this period, viewing spiritualism as a necessary new revelation for a traumatized world. His book, The New Revelation, argued that the evidence of survival after death was the most important scientific and religious discovery in human history. This second wave reinforced the movement's role as a primary vehicle for communal grief. It showed that despite the advances of science and the repeated exposures of fraud, the human need for a tangible connection with the dead remains a powerful and recurring force in times of crisis. The war years solidified the movement's identity as a refuge for the brokenhearted, shifting its focus from physical marvels to emotional healing and spiritual reassurance. In the realm of popular culture, the imagery and tropes of Victorian spiritualism have become a permanent part of the Gothic imagination. The archetypes of the haunted house, the mysterious medium, and the ectoplasmic manifestation continue to dominate horror literature and cinema. Films and television shows often use the séance as a dramatic device to explore themes of unresolved trauma and the persistence of the past. This cultural obsession reflects a lingering fascination with the possibility that our environment is saturated with the memories and presences of those who came before us. Spiritualism provided the modern world with a visual and narrative vocabulary for the uncanny. It turned the domestic space into a site of potential supernatural encounter, a concept that continues to resonate in the era of paranormal investigation, reality shows, and digital ghost hunting. The modern obsession with ghost hunting technology, from electromagnetic field meters to digital voice recorders, is a direct continuation of the Victorian desire to capture the spirit world through scientific instruments. The movement transformed our relationship with our homes, making us sensitive to the idea that the walls themselves might hold the echoes of previous lives. The most profound legacy of the movement is the enduring question it poses about the nature of reality. Spiritualism emerged at a moment when the mechanical worldview of the Industrial Revolution seemed to be stripping the world of its mystery. By insisting on the reality of the unseen, the movement challenged the limits of materialism and forced a dialogue between faith and reason that is still ongoing. The struggle of the Victorian investigators to find a third way between dogmatic religion and cold science prefigured many contemporary debates in quantum physics and philosophy regarding the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. The long shadow of the movement reminds us that the human search for meaning is not a linear path toward total knowledge, but a recursive journey into the unknown. The séance may have changed its form, but the underlying drive to understand our place in the universe and our connection to the infinite remains as strong as ever. The history of spiritualism is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of death and uncertainty. It shows that even in an age of machines and logic, the desire for wonder and the need for love are indestructible forces. The movement's legacy is found in every person who looks at a photograph of a lost relative and feels a sense of continued presence, and in every scientist who dares to investigate the unexplained. The Victorians did not solve the mystery of what lies beyond the grave, but they created a culture that allowed for the question to be asked with passion and intelligence. They left behind a record of their longing and their courage, a vast archive of the human heart's refusal to accept the finality of loss. As we navigate our own era of rapid change, the story of the spiritualists serves as a reminder that the most important frontiers are often the ones that lie within ourselves. Ultimately, the legacies of religion, science, and the long shadow of memory converge in the realization that we are more than just biological machines. The spiritualist movement insisted on the dignity of the individual soul and the permanence of the bonds of affection. It taught us that the world is a much wider and more mysterious place than we often care to admit. The echoes of the rappings and the whispers of the mediums continue to challenge our assumptions and to inspire our imaginations. The movement may have belonged to the 19th century, but its questions belong to all of humanity. The search for the soul continues, a persistent and defining characteristic of our species that refuses to be silenced by the passage of time or the weight of evidence. The table is still set, the room is still dark, and the conversation between the living and the dead remains one of the most vital and haunting dialogues of the human experience. The gaslight flickers as the dawn begins to break over the city streets. The Victorian era eventually gave way to a new century, yet the echoes of the seance room did not vanish with the morning light. We began this journey in a small wooden cabin in Hydesville, where two young sisters discovered that a simple rap could reach across the world. From those modest beginnings, a global phenomenon emerged that challenged the foundations of science and the boundaries of faith. It was a movement fueled by the desperate need to believe that death was not a finality. It offered a map of a world where the voices of the lost could still be heard. The people who sat in those darkened parlors were seekers who lived in a time of radical change. As machines transformed the landscape and science questioned the old gods, spiritualism provided a bridge to a more mysterious reality. The movement survived the mockery of the press and the exposure of its most famous practitioners because it addressed a universal human ache. It promised that the individual identity survived the grave and that the bonds of love remained intact. This was its greatest success. It shifted the focus of religion from the distant and the dogmatic to the personal and the immediate. The image of the joined circle remains the defining symbol of this era. It represents a collective effort to bridge the gap between two worlds. Whether the wrappings were produced by spirits or by clever movements of the feet, the emotional truth of the experience remained valid for those who felt the touch of a vanished hand. This search for connection is a permanent part of the human condition. We see its legacy today in our continued obsession with the unexplained and our hope for something beyond the physical. We leave the Victorian séance room with a sense of the profound vulnerability of the human heart. The history of spiritualism is a record of our longing for the light. It reminds us that we are a species that refuses to accept the silence of the grave. The wrappings have stopped and the curtains have been drawn back, but the questions raised in the darkness remain. We continue to look into the shadows, hoping for a sign that the story does not end here. The movement is a testament to the fact that the most enduring ghosts are the ones born of our own affection and our refusal to say goodbye.